Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the documentary that asks the age-old question. Does every family have a black sheep? Or did we just collectively misplace our eyebrows in a fit of parental despair? Here we have The Prodigal Son, a soft parable for rest, which, spoiler alert, isn't about the latest parenting book that teaches you how to stop yelling at your kids. Because, let's face it, while I'd love to see things turn into a calming meditation on Sunday brunches and mindfulness, we're actually here to dive into the not-so-gentle waters of familial dysfunction and the glorious returns of wayward boys. This documentary isn't just a gentle reminder to hug your loved ones, but a comical, historical deep dive into the antics of a kid who decided that rebellion looked a lot like sampling the local wine and cheese, well, more like the wine, and then proceeding to throw his life into the blender. Because who cultured a fine wine drinking palate while simultaneously losing all common sense in the process? Get ready to journey through the annals of dubious decisions. Think of it as a road trip without GPS. We'll encounter rich absences of wisdom where brothers wage war over a little thing called forgiveness. And just like your average sitcom, you can expect misunderstandings galore. You won't believe the litany of comedic mishaps as this son squanders his inheritance faster than a politician at a fundraising gala. Market trends? What are those? The Prodigal Son. This isn't just a story. It's a chastising lesson in why you should never borrow money from family unless you're prepared to deal with Grandma's inevitable commentary on how the neighbor's child did it far better. And who doesn't love some good old-fashioned guilt-tripping? The ridiculous situations only ramp up as he finds himself in desperate scenarios. Imagine diving into dumpster diving, but in the ancient world. Let's not forget the show-stopping return home. Picture that emotional reel, complete with awkward hugs, eye rolls, and the classic "What have I done with my life" montage. So buckle up for a joyous ride through forgiveness and peace, where we promise you the absolute satisfaction of watching someone else's poor decisions before realizing, hey, maybe family isn't so bad after all. Because in the end, who doesn't relate to a story of lost luggage, misguided choices, and the overwhelming smell of roast lamb wafting from the kitchen? And let's face it, if this family can survive a showdown of petty grievances and nudging forgiveness, it gives this viewer a sense of hope, because surely my last Thanksgiving isn't the worst one we've ever had. Welcome to The Prodigal Son, a soft parable for rest, where the only thing missing from this righteous saga is Uncle Bob's karaoke rendition of My Way on repeat. The year is 1473. The place a sprawling medieval castle kitchen so vast it could double as an echo chamber for whispered betrayals. The uninvited guest, a suspiciously jiggling gelatinous meat aspic, shimmering under the flickering glow of grease-smeared torches. This was no ordinary leftover. It was the culinary equivalent of a ticking time bomb shaped by the previous night as feast bravado. Inside this aromatic chamber of chaos, the air thrummed with the scent of burnt garlic, overripe onions, and the faintly sour undertone of fear, not to mention a hint of yesterday's stew gone rogue. Towering piles of pewter plates clashed in the hands of flustered servants. At the center of this spectacle was Lord Reginald, nobleman, a half and perpetual worrier, eyeing the aspic as if it might suddenly sprout legs and walk away with his dignity. The food at the heart of this fiasco was not just any mold-prone relic. It was a gelatinous monument to excess and poor planning, rumored among the kitchen staff to be cursed by the ghost of the disgruntled pantry cat. Each wobble of the aspic was met with gasps and subtle attempts to inch it out of sight. Our key characters included the jittery head cook, a man who could recite every kitchen disaster as if they were war tales, the skeptical apothecary, who insisted the aspic was a test from God, and the chief scribe taking frantic notes on the culinary drama unfolding before him. With candles guttering and the occasional rat scampering in the shadows, tension thickened like overcooked porridge. Rumors flew of an ancient superstition that aspic consumed on a Wednesday would invoke the wrath of the local feudal lord as ghost, causing 3 days of bad harvests and inexplicable constipation. Bizarre rituals ensued. The head cook performed a solemn dance with a ladle, a move part prayer, part kitchen jazz hands, while the apothecary muttered incantations over a cup of suspiciously lukewarm vinegar. Even the castle bard composed a few verses about the dangerous allure of cold meat set in gelatin, a tale that would surely become a folk hit among cautious villagers. Just as the paralyzing fear reached a crescendo, the twist emerged like an undercooked turkey at a royal feast. It turned out the aspic, feared for its potential to turn tyrants into ghosts and provoke hauntings of the digestive tract, was in fact the latest fashionable delicacy imported from the inexplicably trendy courts of Venice. Lord Reginald, desperate to impress and confuse, had ordered it as a symbol of modernity, a half-hearted apology to gastronomic innovation. The apothecary swiftly revised his grim prophecies as claiming the aspic would actually bring good fortune and flexible bowels to those brave enough to sample it. With a collective gulp and reluctant bites, the kitchen court slowly embraced their jiggly fate, discovering it was less a curse and more a chilled testament to culinary audacity. Historically speaking, aspiring nobles often consumed questionable dishes to showcase sophistication, even if it meant risking mysterious digestive disturbances. It turns out that embracing the latest food trends was the medieval versions of scrolling food blogs today, full of hype, suspicion, and occasional regret. The moral of this gelatinous fable? Never underestimate the power of expired ambition disguised as fancy leftovers. And remember, sometimes the path to rest is paved with wobbling meat, or at least a stiff upper lip and some antacids. Picture this. The year is somewhere certainly before microwave ovens, but hopefully after the invention of forks. Probably the 1st century CE, Judea. The air is thick with anticipation, and the scent of overachieving lamb roasting on a spit, turning tirelessly above a cautiously allocated fire, venerated by at least 3 local prophets and suspicious family members. Welcome to a family reunion unlike any other. The prodigal son is back, bearing gifts and clearly armed with a questionable sense of timing. The scene is set under a laboriously constructed, colorful canopy that flaps like an enthusiastic flag in the mild breeze. Shadows from oil lamps dance against a backdrop of dusty village walls, while the crowd buzzes with a soundtrack of whispered judgments, occasional nose whistles, and the soft weeping of an overly dramatic elder sibling who forgot to bring his sense of humor. At the center, a feast more ambitious than a Roman emperor's toga party. The menu? A suspiciously large hunk of beef, likely to have caused the local butcher to contemplate early retirement. Alongside this meat mountain, dishes of lentils so thought not to offend but strategically bland, stale bread hard enough to serve as weapons if needed, and the infamous fatted calf, the party piece, a symbol of forgiveness and the ultimate cause of indigestion. Tensions simmer faster than the fires beneath the spit. The elder son, a man who by all accounts invented martyrdom, paces as if auditioning for the role of disgruntled statue. The household servants exchange knowing glances, some suspecting the returnee might be part of a traveling circus act rather than a repentant sinner. Meanwhile, the prodigal son himself attempts to navigate this social minefield with all the grace of a goat on a dance floor. Now, the rituals. Guests must first cleanse their hands with a basin of water suspiciously lukewarm, too hot to be comfortable, too cold to be truly refreshing. The feast begins with a blessing from a reluctant patriarch, whose monotone voice suggests he just remembered he forgot the salt. Everyone is expected to partake in the communal drinking of wine, though some elders cast nervous glances at the nearest jar, whispering about historical hangovers that doubled as diplomatic incidents. As the fatted calf arrives, carved ceremoniously by a man who looks as though he'd rather be anywhere else, the elder son's scowl deepens to a shade of purplish maroon previously unrecorded in polite society. The feast descends into awkward silences punctuated by the occasional cough that attempts to disguise stifled laughter or deeper resentment. And then, the twist. As the prodigal son raises his cup to toast, he accidentally spills the entire content onto his lap. The wine, the blessing, the hope for a smooth reintegration, all cascading down in a spectacularly messy fashion. The feast freezes. Even the lamb seems to sigh in exasperation. The elder son attempts a sarcastic clapping, but ends up knocking over his own cup in the struggle. After a moment or two that feels like 13 civil wars rolled into a family therapy session, laughter surprisingly breaks out. Not the forced kind, but real, messy, human laughter. Even the elder son manages a reluctant smile. The wine-stained tunic becomes less a symbol of disgrace and more an emblem of imperfect forgiveness. Historically, family feasts of this nature were as much about social posturing as they were about actual reconciliation. The fatted calf was less about gourmet indulgence and more a symbol of social status and a carefully managed public apology. Not to mention that bringing back large cuts of meat was a logistical nightmare, often involving bribes to the local tax collector who presumably enjoyed the chaos. So what have we unearthed from this feasting fiasco? Never underestimate the power of spilled wine to bring a family together, or the utility of a hard bread crust as an unintentional microphone during tense speeches. And above all, remember, forgiveness might be best served messy, with a generous helping of awkwardness and a side of lachrymose laughter. Picture this. The year is 1587. The place is a modest village somewhere in Eastern Europe where the ceiling beams are so ancient they practically complain about the crumbs dropping on them. It is the hour shortly after midday, a time devoted exclusively to the sacred ritual known as the Great Bread Break, a ceremony that could make a Renaissance festival look like a casual potluck. The air? Thick with the robust sense of freshly baked rye, slightly burnt wood from the oven, and that faint, unfathomable smell of old socks left under the table for too long. Our protagonist, Ivan, a man whose fashion sense screams, "I left my Peasants' Guild meeting early to catch a nap," is about to make a decision that will forever change his relationship with carbohydrates and familial expectations. Now, bread in Ivan's village is no ordinary foodstuff. It's a symbol of life, death, and just an awful lot of undignified family drama. The bread itself is a formidable loaf, round and crusty, baked with just enough negligence to inspire mild fear. Historically, this bread serves not only as nourishment but as a canvas for passive-aggressive messages from mother to son. You could almost hear the unspoken admonitions toasted into each crumb. Why didn't you visit more? Are you alive or just surviving? And did you remember to wash behind your ears? Enter the village baker, a figure part artisan, part gossip columnist, wielding a rolling pin like a scepter, presiding over his doughy domain with suspicious zeal. Legend has it, he practices a secret bread ritual involving mystical kneading patterns believed to ward off hangovers, bad harvests, and inconveniently curious neighbors. The tension builds as Ivan approaches the table, eyeing the bread with all the reverence of a man about to sign a legally binding contract with gluten. The village elders, witnesses to this culinary saga, murmur prayers thought to protect from yeast-related curses and the humbling consequence of a flat loaf. Paranoia runs high. If the bread breaks on the wrong side, it foretells a season of bad luck or stubborn relatives dropping in unannounced. As Ivan breaks the bread, the entire village seems to hold its breath, or maybe they're just holding on to their lunches. The moment of truth. The bread is, surprisingly, soft and inviting. Yet, just as Ivan takes his first bite, a twist of fate unfolds. A stray chicken, trained by local children for no apparent reason, snatches the last crumb from his fingers, igniting a small, polite uproar about property rights and poultry ethics. What does this mean for Ivan and the village? The bread was never just food. It was a test of patience, humility, and the ability to agree on a universally enforced nap time immediately after eating. Historically, bread has been central to human civilization, yet in Ivan's village it acquired the additional weight of familial expectations and poultry diplomacy. So here's what we learned. In the grand feast of life, never underestimate the power of a loaf, nor the capability of a rogue chicken to rewrite your destiny. If the path to rest is set the stage. Paris, 1789. It's a gloomy afternoon. Fog creeping through cobblestone alleys like a nosy relative who just won a prize for subtlety. The air carried the acrid scent of burnt toast, or perhaps it was baguettes scorched by the mounting tensions of a population just a few yeasts away from uprising. Meanwhile, the aristocracy feasted in gilded halls where bread was less about sustenance and more about scandal. Our key players, Madame Guillotine, who owned neither a head nor a sense of humor, and Jean-Baptiste, the unlucky boulanger whose loaves became the hottest topic since Marie Antoinette's alleged fondness for cake. Imagine racks lined with crusty bread resembling miniature armor, bearing the weight of distrust and rising yeast. There was more at stake than just crumbs. In a city where the yeast could whisper secrets and the crust might conceal a revolt, bread wasn't merely food. It was a weapon, a signal, a social ticker tape. Paranoia fermented like sourdough. Noble guests engaged in a curious ritual, sniffing loaves with suspicious intensity, as if trying to detect dissent between the sesame seeds. Rumors swirled that bakers hid poor peasants' amyllies in their ovens, or worse, laced dough with sedition. The smell of fresh bread became a siren for spies and informants, and every bite was potentially a bite from the hand that fed the revolution. Before each meal, wine glasses clinked while eyes darted toward the bread basket, calculating loyalty in crumbs. Then, the twist that would make any carb lover weep. After an intense bakery raid orchestrated by officials fearing a baguette uprising, the main accused was caught not with contraband bread, but with an illicit stash of croissants. The buttery delicacies had been smuggled under powdered wigs, disguised as simple rolls. It turned out the scandal was less about rebellion and more about revolutionizing breakfast. The officials, confused and hungry, had to reconsider whether their war was against politics or pastries. Jean-Baptiste caped the guillotine thanks to a particularly persuasive argument about flaky layers and divine indulgence. Historically, bread did carry weight beyond the table. Bread shortages in pre-revolutionary France were as explosive as the pamphlets circulating in cafe back rooms. But who knew that the true battlefield was the breakfast table? After all, nothing screams civil unrest quite like a butter shortage. Moral of this slice? Never underestimate the power of simple carbs in turning a nation upside down. And if you ever find yourself accused of subversion, make sure your weapon of choice is delicious and flaky. Rest easy, for in the world of crumbs and crowns, even the softest loaf can cause the hardest fall. Imagine it is the year 1787, midday, in a small English village where the sun seems to glare down with the intensity of a tax collector auditing pleasure gardens. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and overstressed leather, and the streets echo with the clatter of horse hooves determined to get somewhere important, nowhere near the idea of rest. At the heart of this sleepy rebellion stands the protagonist, young Tobias Tittlewick, a man whose idea of productivity suspiciously involves a suspicious number of naps. The food of the hour, or rather the forbidden fruit, is a modest plate of roast pork and mashed potatoes, the stereotypical dinner of hard-working folk, but with a twist. It just might be the cause of the village's most scandalous uprising. Lighting the scene is a murky afternoon sky filtering the golden glow through dusty window panes where idle cobwebs hang like forgotten promises. The crowded tavern is alive with a chorus of burps and soothed snores as Tobias, the self-proclaimed nap enthusiast, reclines unceremoniously in a rickety chair. He smells faintly of stale ale and rebellion, and his eyes, half-lidded, carry the weight of a man who has taken the sacred art of relaxation just a tad too seriously. Except in Tobias Village, rest is not a virtue but a suspicious sign of slackery. Here, the dinner table doubles as a battlefield, and the plate of roast pork carries more political tension than Parliament during election season. The town elders, forever jittery from their unending schedules of meetings about other meetings, have declared naps an existential threat to the economy, the moral fabric, and the village's prized goose population. As Tobias reaches for his pork, the moment thickens. There is a peculiar ritual before ingesting the food. A communal sniff to ensure no slumber-inducing herbs have been stealthily sprinkled in. It is whispered that the mashed potatoes themselves might be laced with soporifics designed to topple the town's fragile productivity. The village's superstitions run wild. Some swear that an afternoon nap will summon the dreaded dozing demon, a mythical creature that dissolves willpower and replaces it with dreams of embarrassing ancestor mishaps. Tobias, undeterred, carefully lifts a forkful and chews with the deliberate seriousness of a man defying centuries of anti-rest propaganda. The tavern holds its breath. Around him, villagers sharpen their pitchforks, not to fight a revolution, but to metaphorically impale the very idea of taking a break. Yet, as Tobias's eyelids flutter shut mid-chew, the reaction is not outrage but unexpected solidarity. One by one, the crowd succumbs, a chorus of yawns rising like a battle cry for sleep. The twist? The roast pork, rumored to be the meal of Satan's agents, is revealed to be perfectly harmless, if not mildly underseasoned. The real culprit behind the uprising being the county's new nap tax, introduced by a bureaucrat who clearly loathes pillow fluff as a concept. As the village collectively embraces an impromptu siesta, the elders' doom and gloom predictions crumble like stale crusts. Historically, England did flirt with the idea that rest could be counterproductive during its industrial rise, a period where sleep was as rare and valuable as a unicorn sighting. Workers were encouraged to maximize output, with only a glance sideways permitted at comfort or relaxation. Tobias' tale, though exaggerated, nods subtly to the eternal human struggle for balance between rest and duty. So what have we gleaned from Tobias's nap revolution? That sometimes the softest rebellions, those fought with closed eyes and quiet snoring, may just be the ones that change your world. And perhaps the true moral is this: never underestimate a man who dares to feast and then promptly faceplant into the nearest available chair. Productivity is overrated. Rest, it turns out, could be the most subversive act of all. Picture this: a stubbornly sunny afternoon in the heart of Renaissance Italy, circa 1523. The scene is a sprawling villa garden where the scent of freshly cut grass mingles oddly with the less charming aroma of overripe cheese left to ferment in the sun. Because cleanliness was optional and Parmesan patience was in short supply. Enter the prodigal son, not with the customary fatted calf, but brandishing a rather unfortunately charred chicken, purchased from the local market where rats and merchants share equal enthusiasm for haggling. The air hums with the sounds of noble gossip and clinking goblets filled inconveniently with slightly sour wine. Our main characters, the wayward son, a father with the patience of a saint who clearly never read his own bedtime stories, and a household staff whose loyalty apparently expires with decent table manners. The star of this gracious disaster? A fowl of questionable origin and even more questionable preparation, intended as a triumphant offering and instead doubling as a test of digestive fortitude. Tensions rise with remarkable speed. The son, eager to prove he earned his freedom yet unaware of his culinary faux pas, presents the blackened bird to his father, who eyes it with a mix of hope and mild terror. Meanwhile, the servants circulate tidbits of superstition. That eating burnt meat invites bad luck, that birds cooked at odd hours might carry the whisper of a curse, and that any chicken not blessed by the village priest before cooking could lead to eternal indigestion, a fate worse than exile itself. The feast becomes a ritualistic cautionary tale as the family navigates this carnivorous minefield with the grace of a drunken tightrope walker. Just as the father prepares to bless the meal with words that sound suspiciously like a plea for mercy, the family dog, driven half-mad by the scent of charred fowl, leaps onto the table and absconds with the chicken in one swift motion, leaving behind a stunned circle of diners and an oddly relieved son. The fallout? A collective sigh of disappointment overshadowed by unanimous gratitude that no one fell ill, or worse, worsied, by the offering. Historically, we must note with a wry smile that feasts in the Renaissance were less about gastronomic excellence and more about social maneuvering. One's reputation could be roasted just as thoroughly as a chicken, often in front of an audience eager to catch even the slightest slip in etiquette or edibility. So, the takeaway here: when life gives you a burnt chicken, let the dog have it. Sometimes the best way to mend fences is to avoid digesting the evidence. Remember, picture this. London, 1789. A fog so thick it could be sliced with a butter knife, and a royal kitchen bustling with the frenetic energy of over-caffeinated pastry chefs. The scent of butter, sugar, and impending disaster hangs heavy in the air, mingling with the occasional nervous cough of servants trying not to spill the Queen's rumored favorite, the infamous blueberry pie. The key players, His Majesty King George, prone to sulking after one too many political blunders. Lady Euphemia, the Queen's chief taster renowned for her ability to detect scandal with just a nibble. And Mr. Crustworthy, head baker, whose pride in his flaky masterpiece threatened the delicate balance of court stability. This was no ordinary pie. No, it was a tartan-wrapped royal decree disguised as a dessert, a sugary symbol of peace in a time when diplomacy was often soggier than a soggy bottom. Tensions were rising, not because of foreign enemies, but because the pie had suspiciously vanished moments before the grand reveal. Enter the ritual panic. The royal hunts for the missing dessert included deciphering cryptic pastry crumbs, interpreting the fluttering of napkins as coded messages, and the age-old practice of blaming the scullery cat, which ironically only deepened paranoia about feline espionage. Half the court donned powdered wigs not just for style, but to conceal their rapidly growing second thoughts about who among them was actually loyal to the throne, or secretly a dessert anarchist. Just as the atmosphere thickened like a badly set custard, the astonishing twist: the pie hadn't been stolen or sabotaged, but accidentally eaten by the king himself during a stress-induced midnight snack session disguised as royal contemplation. The ensuing scandal? Less about the pie and more about royal snacking habits, which sparked endless satire among the populace and a new law: no unguarded food in the presence of royalty. Historically speaking, pie diplomacy was no joke in 18th century England, where misunderstandings over confectionery could lead to actual conflicts. A true testament to the fact that sometimes the biggest threats come in the flakiest packages. The takeaway? Never underestimate the power of a missing pie. It might just crumble your entire kingdom, or at least your dinner party. In short, when it comes to politics, it is a foggy autumn evening, 16th century in a bustling European manner where the main event is not a masquerade ball or a duel of honor, but a puzzling ceremony involving a spoon and a nap to end all naps. The air smells faintly of roasting chestnuts and desperation, with a faint hum of servants clattering in the candlelit halls. Here, we meet Lord Ambrose, a notoriously impatient nobleman, along with his dutiful but weary household, and the culinary centerpiece, the infamous sleeping stew, a thick concoction rumored to induce a rest so deep it borders on mystical coma. The solemnity of the setting is disrupted by whispered legends that whoever eats the stew must not engage in any form of labor for 3 full days, or risk turning into a permanent fixture of the manor, essentially a glorified coat rack. The tension rises palpably as fluffy pillowcases are fluffed with exaggerated care, and every clock's ticking is met with a cautious glance. Time, it seems, is a volatile ingredient. Superstitions dictate that to taste the stew without proper ceremonial yawns invited by the chamber's authorized sleep herald is to become cursed with eternal first shift fatigue. As the pot bubbles ominously, the household debate reaches peak absurdity. Does the stew really grant rest, or just current civilization's sly excuse to promote lounging? The climax. Lord Ambrose takes a profound spoonful, closes his eyes dramatically, and moments later is found snoring in the great hall, surrounded by equally napping servants. The twist? The stew was, in fact, a clever blend of mild sedatives and overcooked barley, popular recipes passed down by apothecaries masquerading as chefs, and no one is quite sure who ended up truly resting or just playing along with the farce. Historically, this feast mocked the relentless hustle of early modern aristocracy, who fancied rest as a luxury and not a necessity, revealing that even then, a well-placed nap was the most rebellious act of all. The grand takeaway. If you ever find yourself desperate for rest, question whether the cure might just be a spoonful of nonsense served with a side of theatrics. Never underestimate the power of a soft excuse to sit still. It might just be the greatest revolution disguised as a meal. And envision the year 539 BC. The grand city of Babylon, basking under the blistering Mesopotamian sun, the streets buzzing like a bazaar on double espresso. Amidst the splendor and scaffolding of ziggurats, the scent of roasting meat clouds the air, an aroma potent enough to cause diplomatic incidents and culinary wars alike. Inside Nebuchadnezzar's royal palace, high ceilings strained under mosaics shimmering with tales of conquest, and the scent of sandalwood mixed perplexedly with charred lamb. Here we meet the key players. Nebuchadnezzar himself, proud conqueror with a penchant for impractical wine goblets. His chief cook, Zana, who secretly nursed ambitions of replacing his ladle with a scepter, and the food of the hour, a majestic spit roast lamb, glistening as if auditioning for divinity itself. The roast was no mere meal. It was a political statement shaped by ancient superstitions and a dash of sheer paranoia. Goblets were filled not just with wine, but with elaborate concoctions meant to ward off curses from envious gods or disgruntled exiled princes. Before carving, the lamb was rubbed in a sacred blend of herbs so potent that nearby servants clutched their noses, praying it was tradition and not a new form of torture. The ritual to prepare and serve the roast followed a script more complex than any treaty. Firstly, Zana was required to dance a surprisingly vigorous interpretive dance symbolizing prosperity, much to the amusement and occasional astonishment of court scribes. Next, the lamb was presented to Nebuchadnezzar, who would close his eyes and sniff deeply, attempting to divine the luck embedded in the spice mix. Then, the royal soothsayer shot a look that could freeze pudding, proclaiming the stars aligned favorably for devouring the meat. Tensions mounted as Nebuchadnezzar teased at the lamb with his dagger, never quite committing. the court held its breath. Was this royal hesitation born from strategic caution or indigestion from last night's banquet? Suddenly, just as the king was about to take a bite, a pigeon crashed through a stained glass window, landing squarely on the roast, leaving behind a calling card of feathers and a suspicious splatter. Chaos erupted. Was this divine intervention or the disgruntled cook's apprentice attempting sabotage? The roast was whisked away for a second round of incense fumigation, mumbling apologies to the gods and, inconveniently, one very ruffled pigeon. In reality, Babylonian feasts often teetered on the edge of absurdity, with sacred rituals that intertwined politics, religion, and a questionable dedication to seasoning that modern chefs might categorize as aggressive. And so the lesson from Babylon's restless roast? No matter how finely seasoned your ambitions, expect the odd pigeon to dive. Picture this. It is the year 1523, a humid afternoon in a small Flemish village where the smell of freshly baked bread competes with the unmistakable stench of mild civic unrest. The village square is packed not with merchants or troubadours, but with irate bakers wielding rolling pins and an unusual weapon, their own sourdough starters, bubbling with the fury of 1,000 fermented grievances. Heavy clouds gather. Torches flicker as if applauding the chaos about to unfold. The air is thick with the scent of yeasty rebellion and a hint of burnt crusts, while the distant clatter of wooden cartwheels echoes over angry murmurs. Key players include the cantankerous master baker Joris, whose prized oven has just been sabotaged with an unholy mixture of expired hops and misguided hopes, and young Lena, the prodigal baker's daughter, who's just returned from the city with a cursed recipe rumored to cause insomnia, or worse, perfectly fluffy bread. Indeed, the item at the heart of this carb catastrophe is none other than the elusive restless loaf, a bread so soft and pillowy that it allegedly keeps its eaters awake through interminable nights, pondering crumb structure instead of resting their weary heads. But it's not just about bread. This village has turned baking into a battleground of rituals that would make even the most fastidious monk raise an eyebrow. Each loaf must be blessed by the village elder while chanting archaic dough-spinning incantations. Superstition dictates that bread baked on an unlucky day would shrink during its rise, causing despair to anyone who dared to toast it. Paranoia has set in. Rumors spread that the royal millet has been replaced with enchanted rye, capable of turning even the most serene sleeper into a jittery night owl. The tension peaks as the village bakery's oven hermetically seals itself, possibly as a defense mechanism against the rising tide of unrest. Villagers begin to speculate wildly, convinced the bread itself has become sentient, plotting revenge for years of kneading and poking. Then, in a twist that bakes the situation irreversibly sweet or sour depending on your taste, Lena unveils the secret ingredient: a dollop of honey fermented in moonlight, a whimsical experiment she imported from the city that actually puts people into such deep, restful sleep they miss entire mornings. Panic turned to relief and then to gleeful napping. The Great Bread Rebellion is quelled not with swords or decrees, but with sleepy sighs and the soft snoring of a once-ariled populace finally tasting rest. Historically speaking, the obsession with bread continued to knead its way into European lives for centuries with varying results. After all, no revolution ever really rises without a good loaf to rally around. And the takeaway? Perhaps the softest bread, like the prodigal son, knows to come home not to the— Picture this: a gloomy evening in a musty European village, year 1624. The air thick with the scent of damp earth, smoked sausages, and an inexplicably aggressive waft of fermented fish. Flickering candlelight casts jittery shadows on the wooden planks of the town hall, which doubles as the newly appointed feast central for the annual Rest Festival. Yes, a festival dedicated to rest. But ironically enough, it involves large quantities of food and zero actual repose. Enter our protagonist, Jacob, the prodigal son of rest, famed across 3 villages for his uncanny ability to treat a nap like a competitive sport. Jacob's elder brother, Hugo, has been busy preaching the gospel of industry, working from dawn till the rooster's 5th crow, while Jacob is about to shatter all previous records of indulgent sloth. Tonight's centerpiece: a colossal vat of sauerbraten, that gloriously marinated German roast so potent it could double as a sleep inducer or a biochemical weapon. The room buzzes with excitement and suspicion, because nothing screams rest like debating whether meat can actually orchestrate your unconsciousness. The lighting is dim, designed to lull the senses, backed by a folk band playing melodramatically slow tunes peppered with occasional frantic bagpipe outbursts that sound like a wheezing cat being chased by a banshee. The smells? Imagine a tire fire burning in a garden of roses, then mixed with the unmistakable tang of sauerkraut left in a sealed jar since— well, nobody really remembers. Locals gather, clutching mugs of questionable ale, eyes darting between Jacob, who looks increasingly at peace, and Hugo, who frowns so deeply his beard nearly detaches. The food, though seemingly innocent, is the epicenter of village superstition. Legend has it that the precise marinade formula, when ignored or altered, invites the infamous restless burp, an affliction causing involuntary twitching and philosophical debates at midnight. Preparations are theatrical. Jacob insists on a solemn ritual involving 3 spoonfuls of sour cream, a whispered apology to the ancestral cows, and an interpretative dance representing digestive harmony, performed by the elder's cousin who inexplicably thinks she's a chicken. Audience members exchange nervous glances, half expecting the dance to summon some sort of bovine deity. As the feast begins, Jacob devours the sauerbraten with the enthusiasm of a man who's just discovered the meaning of soft living. Then, the room falls into a tense silence. Will the restless burp claim its victim? Jacob clears his throat, ponders deeply, and then, with unexpected grace, slips into a nap so profound the chairs beneath him consider renaming themselves in his honor. A stunned hush spreads. Even the bagpipe player ceases his wheezing. Hugo, goblet halfway to his lips, looks incredulously at his brother, realizing with dawning horror that Jacob has mastered the art of rest not through labor, but through expertly crafted feasting. Historians might note that the 1620s were rife with efforts to balance work and leisure, often resulting in contradictory customs, like the Rest Festival's vigorous celebration erroneously equated with relaxation. But what really killed the tension was Jacob's snore, a rhythmic lullaby that inspired the town to reconsider their frantic approach to life. So, what have we learned here? When life gives you fermented meat, turn it into a sacrifice. Cue the medieval buzz. year. Somewhere between the invention of sliced bread and the Great Famine, a surprisingly vague period for carb connoisseurs. Place, a humble village bakery nestled in the misty hills where the yeast rises not only the dough, but also tempers. The sun was just a polite idea behind a curtain of clouds, the scent of flour and burnt ambitions mixed in the air like a dysfunctional family reunion. The bakery, quite modest, showcased two stubborn bakers, Old Man Crust, who swore by ancient fermentation secrets passed down from his great-great-great-grandfather, who reportedly once fed a whole battalion using nothing but stale baguettes, and young Sprout, a bold apprentice with a suspiciously futuristic approach involving unauthorized use of wild yeasts and, scandalously, rest days for dough. The bread at the heart of the burning debate was, naturally, the village's staple, a crusty loaf known locally as the humble round. Just a simple affair of flour, water, salt, and yeast, yet imbued with enough symbolic weight to inspire operatic quarrels and the burning of questionable sourdough starters. The tension? Palpable. Imagine a silent courtroom drama where the yeast was both jury and executioner. Old Man Crust believed bread was a physical manifestation of hard work. Knead, prove, bake, eat, repeat, no rest, no mercy. Sprout, however, championed the radical idea that dough needed naps, restful respites to let gluten relax and flavors compose themselves like a medieval bard tuning his lute. Local superstitions added spice to this bready drama. Legend had it that interrupting dough's rest would summon the dreaded yeast ghost, a spectral entity that turned dough rubbery and unchewable, cursed to eternally stick to jaws and spark kingdom-wide indigestion. To combat this menace, bakers conducted nightly rituals involving whispered apologies to the flour gods and a ceremonial tap dance around ovens. An ancient performance part dance, part protest, all confusion. Our two bakers squared off in what the locals dubbed the Great Bread Debate. Old Man Crust brandished his wooden spoon like a sword, declaiming the dangers of laziness. A loaf that rests too long breeds weakness. Sprout responded with a calm smile, waving proofing baskets as evidence that patience was the true secret ingredient. As the sun slid down the horizon and shadows stretched like overworked dough, the village elder, a figure reputed to have slept through the entire famine, intervened. His pronouncement reframed the quarrel entirely. Turns out, the yeast had been the mischievous culprit all along. Unbeknownst to everyone, the yeast was from a new batch sourced mysteriously from the east, known for aggressive rising and an unfortunate tendency to cause minor explosions in ovens. The twist? The bread was perfectly fine, no ghostly curses required. The explosive rising was blamed on improper starter handling syndrome ISHS, a medical condition diagnosed only by skeptical bakers and politically motivated millers. Relief swept through the bakery like warm dough, and even Old Man Crust grudgingly allowed a brief rest period for the dough, on the condition the yeast behave itself next time. Historically, fermented breads indeed revolutionized diets and economies. But the battle over resting dough? Pure human habit and stubbornness, masked by mystical yeast lore and the eternal struggle between work ethic and well-deserved rest. So the grand lesson in our soft parable? Even the mightiest son of yeast must learn to rest lest he wakes a ghost, or worse, ruins dinner. In the realm of bread and life, sometimes the best results come not from pushing harder, but from simply letting the dough take a nap. Picture it. 16th century France, a lavishly over-decorated royal kitchen where the scent of melting butter tangles with whispers of imminent culinary catastrophe. Around noon, the royal cook's apprentice, a spry youth with dreams bigger than his ladle, manages to misplace an entire goose, yes, a whole goose, in the labyrinth of storage rooms. Not misplaced in the innocent toddler sense, but spirited away by some mysterious force that many swore was enchanted. The lighting is dim with flickering torchlight casting theatrical shadows on the stone walls, while a faint clatter of ceramic dishes being nervously shuffled echoes in the background. The air is both pungent with roasting garlic and thick with pending panic. Enter King Henri, a man famous as much for his flamboyant ruffled collars as his remarkably short fuse between the first bite and haughty judgment. He is flanked by the formidable Duchess Claudette, whose nose can sniff out a hint of scandal in anything, be it court gossip or the faintest trace of burnt crust. The center of this feathered fiasco is, of course, the elusive goose, meant for the king's midday feast and the pinnacle of the maitre d's reputation. This bird is no ordinary poultry. It's been pampered on a secret diet of black truffle essence and whispered compliments, ensuring the liver would melt like butter and the skin crackle like morning frost. Losing it wasn't just losing dinner, it was losing face, dignity, and possibly a gig in the next royal procession. Tension thickens as rumors fly faster than the pigeons in the garden. The kitchen staff, in a collective frenzy, turn to rituals bordering on the absurd. The head cook insists on performing the ancient poultry incantation, an elaborate chant believed to coax lost birds out of hiding, layered with dramatic hand gestures obviously inspired by the local mime troupe. Meanwhile, lurking superstitions abound. Some whisper that a disgruntled goose spirit is exacting revenge for its captivity. Others suspect the rival chef from the neighboring duchy, who apparently once fumbled a goose so badly it ended up in the moat. The paranoia spirals into a bizarre game of blame. Was it sabotage, bad luck, or a secret curse activated by the sheer disappointment of impending hunger? Servants scurry about brandishing garlic cloves and peculiar feathers they swore belonged to a phoenix, hoping to ward off any misfortune. The royal jester, seeing a chance for mischief, tries to sneak in a live chicken labeled goose in disguise, only to be promptly escorted out amid peals of nervous laughter. Just when all hope seems lost and the king's stomach rumbles louder than the court chatter, a shocking twist unfolds. The missing goose, it turns out, was caught strolling nonchalantly near the wine cellar. It had apparently escaped its confines hours earlier, taking a leisurely hike to avoid the roasting pan. The king, amused by the revelation, decrees that henceforth all geese must be escorted by a guard, a measure less about security and more about preventing midnight adventures. A historical footnote. In Renaissance France, geese were indeed considered not just a food source, but carriers of prestige. Losing one could lead to serious embarrassment, but more often, the geese themselves had a knack for disappearing inexplicably, fueling folkloric tales and inspiring early goose-herding laws still remembered with a smirk. So what's the real takeaway from this feathery fiasco? Never underestimate the cunning of a goose with wanderlust, especially when your kingdom's dignity is on the line. And remember, sometimes the best way to restore order is to let the prodigal bird come home on its own terms, preferably before the soup spoils. Scene opens in a modest medieval village bakery circa 1327, dawn breaking over thatch roofs with a scent far from inspirational. 6 today. We savor fresh croissants. Here, the local specialty was a suspiciously dense loaf rumored to double as a weapon or a wall prop. Our hero, a slightly weary baker named Edmund, is about to turn his humble shop into a hub of gastronomic and social chaos. The bakery is lit by the feeble glow of a single tallow candle flickering against shadowy, flour-speckled walls. Yeasty tang mingles awkwardly with the pervasive smell of unwashed wool from patrons whose noses have forgotten what fresh air feels like. Enter Lady Mabel, the local noblewoman with more teeth involved in gossip than in meals, and Sir Horace, a knight whose armor clinks as much as his brittle ego. The central focus, a newly baked loaf of what the townsfolk affectionately named the Iron Brick. This stubborn bread, celebrated for its tenacity to defeat even the most plastic fork-wielding village children, is poised to be the centerpiece of the annual Harvest Festival, a feast so prestigious it may as well have been sponsored by chaos. Now, the ritual surrounding the Iron Brick is nothing short of comedic opera. Legend has it the bread's strength is derived from a secret ingredient, the despair of villagers left hungry during winter. Bakers undertake a solemn vow to knead not just flour and water, but the collective frustration of the township into every crust. Before the festival, the loaf undergoes ceremonial tapping 6, a delicate percussion to ascertain if the bread is sufficiently unyielding. Too soft? Mockery ensues. Too hard? Teeth break, tempers flare. Amid ritual verses muttered by the village elder who, truth be told, is half asleep and mostly mumbling about his arthritis, tensions rise as the bread is tapped. The crack sends a shockwave through the crowd. Some cheer, others panic. Sir Horace, ever the dramatist, claims the loaf's resistance is a metaphor for his chivalry. Lady Mabel suspects witchcraft. Edmund just wants someone to eat the blasted thing without losing a tooth. As the festival proceeds, a twist unfolds. The Iron Brick proves impervious not to teeth, but to any knife or taste. The villagers attempt various traditional methods of consumption: dunking in ale, smashing with rocks, pleading with the heavens. None succeed. Meanwhile, chronicler Bartholomew records the debacle with amused detachment, noting how conflict abated as all parties united against the invincible bread. Historically, bread often bore significant symbolic weight, but the Middle Ages took it a notch further, elevating daily bread into an epic saga of survival, patience, and community grudgingly bonded over dental trauma. The moral? Sometimes your sacrifice isn't in what you give, but in what you bite off to keep the peace. Or, as village wisdom now decrees, never trust a loaf that doubles as a weapon its bread, not a siege engine. Picture this. The year is 1347, deep in the kingdom of insomnia, a land rumored to be cursed not by plague or famine, but by eternal wakefulness. The setting, a dimly lit banquet hall where torches sputter like asthma patients, and the air hangs heavy with the scent of burnt bread and crushed lavender. An odd but deliberate attempt to induce calm. At the center of this restless chaos sits our hero, the prodigal son, recently returned from a legendary journey through markets, monasteries, and questionable taverns, clutching a loaf of bread so soft it could easily pass for a cloud with crust issues. Enter the bread. Not just any bread. This was the famed pillow loaf, baked once a year by the sleepy monks of Slumberland Abbey, a recipe so hush-hush it involved the strategic use of exactly 4 drops of poppy essence, a whisper of honey, and a prayer to the god of naps. Legend had it that whoever consumed this bread would not just eat, but also embrace the sweet arms of rest, a commodity sorely missing in the land. Oh, but don't be fooled by the seemingly benign carbs. In Insomnia Kingdom, eating was less about nourishment and more about navigating a ritual as intricate as a cat's schedule. Before the first bite, diners had to perform the solemn ceremony of the yawn, a mandatory and highly synchronized yawn that was supposed to open the gate of somnolence but often just resulted in awkward stares and neck cramps. Following that, the bread had to be blessed by the Grand Napkeeper, a figure clad in the most ridiculous velvet pajamas, whose nod determined whether the meal was fit for inducing dreams or destined to provoke a caffeine binge instead. The tension builds because the prodigal son, in a moment of supreme irony, decides that the best way to make a grand entrance is not to eat and meditate on the pillow loaf, but to challenge it. With exaggerated gusto, he bites in, only to immediately start performing involuntary naps, much to the horror of the insomnia-addled nobles who feared their only hope for sleep would be snatched away. Screams echo as the chamber echoes with the rumble of snores and the slapstick spectacle of lords trying desperately not to doze off mid-toast. The queen, wide-eyed and clutching a goblet of stale mead, demands an intervention. Enter the royal physician, a cranky fellow who's convinced that sleep is just a conspiracy invented by bakers to sell more bread. After examining the prodigal son with all the gravitas of a man who just wants his lunch break, the physician declares that the pillow loaf is indeed the culprit, a loaf so potent it could overthrow dynasties by putting pesky rulers to sleep during important debates. Realizing the danger, the nobles reluctantly agree to a ceasefire, concluding that sometimes the greatest rebellion is simply the refusal to stay awake. In reality, medieval sleep rituals were often as bizarre as the bread itself, involving everything from weighted blankets stuffed with herbs to mysterious lutes playing lullabies that sometimes put entire armies to sleep. Or so the rumors say. The pillow loaf might be a fiction, but the desperate human quest for rest is as real as a knight's bad armor fitting. So what is the painstaking lesson here? Never underestimate the political power of a soft loaf, and always respect the profound art of the nap. After all, even prodigal sons know when to close their eyes. Picture a sleepy village somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, year 1729 BC, at precisely dawn. The air is crisp with the smell of freshly baked bread wafting from a communal oven so ancient it probably remembers the invention of chewing gum. But this is no ordinary morning, because the village decides today that their sacred daily bread will host a family reunion of biblical proportions. Enter the prodigal loaf, the one bread that dared to rise too much, muster a crust too thick, and claim independence from the baker's cautious hand. The sun casts golden light across the squishy, yeast-filled battlefield, while birds tweet their inappropriately cheery songs, oblivious to the rising tension. The village patriarchs gather, their faces creased with worry lines competing in depth with the loaf's fissures. Standing by is the baker, a man whose job title has unofficially been upgraded to Yeast Whisperer, for reasons both mystical and mildly suspicious. The center of this drama is the prodigal loaf itself, thick, crusty, and pungent with hints of burnt ambition and a touch of rebellion. The aroma is an unusual cocktail of charred hope and undercooked aspirations. Rituals ensue. The loaf is passed around with reverence usually reserved for sacred scrolls or cholera antidotes. Elders chant an ancient bread prayer, suspected to have more to do with convincing the loaf to behave than divine intervention. Superstitions abound. Some claim the loaf's stubborn crust is cursed by the yeast demon laziness. Others insist the crumb texture foretells the village's fate in upcoming harvests. Paranoia takes on full mode as reluctant children eye the bread suspiciously, certain that the sunken middle hides some sinister payload like a secret pocket of bad omens, or even an unexpected raisin. When the final judge takes a cautious bite, the village collectively holds its breath, a moment so tense it could curdle fresh milk on the spot. The verdict? Surprisingly, the prodigal loaf is edible, albeit defiantly crunchy and oddly chewy in a way that suggests it has stories to tell and crumbs of scandal. The twist? The baker admits he accidentally used salt instead of sugar, while distracted by a squirrel's audacious theft of his last dough ball. This revelation transforms the bread from a feared omen into the village's first culinary comedy hit. A bread that unites rather than divides, with salty laughter replacing sour suspicion across the land. Historically, bread has been life's staff, but apparently it also moonlights as a familial scapegoat, embodying all the quirks and disputes one can pack into a loaf of carb-heavy history. Moral: always check your ingredient labels carefully, or your bakery may birth the next prodigal son, destined to crumble before even the oven's judgment. In the grand saga of life's feasts, never underestimate the drama that can arise when dough decides to live its own truth. Picture it. Paris, 1789. The grand salons of the aristocracy buzz more with idle gossip than actual political discourse. The fragrance in the air stems not from revolution, but from a suspiciously overcooked eclair that looks like it's been through a battlefield. Powdered sugar scattered like confetti after a royal blunder. The time? Tea o'clock, or as the nobles called it, the hour of delicacy and distrust. In this gilded chamber, a young, discontented scion of the rich de Maison Croissant, the prodigal pastry, prepares to commit the ultimate act of culinary defiance. His father, a portly nobleman, with flour-dusted cuffs and a penchant for haughty disdain, sits primly, a delicate teacup balanced precariously in one hand, the other poised over a porcelain plate holding the infamous eclair, which proudly boasts a sogginess only a true master of desserts could achieve. The lighting is as extravagant as the tensions. Crystal chandeliers drip with candlelight that flickers against tapestries embroidered with scenes of peaceful feasts and, ironically, hunger strikes. The air is heavy with an aroma of burning caramel and a faint undertone of desperation. Clinking silverware punctuates the uneasy silence, mingling with whispers of early revolutionary rumblings and, so the servants swear, faint cries from an overworked baker's guild. Why all the fuss over a shamefully soggy eclair? Because in the days before Instagram influencers, Pastry was power and soufflé a symbol of social status. The pastry was the currency of trust, and sogginess indicated sedition, or worse, restlessness. To rest on one's laurels was an unforgivable decadence, a soft éclair, a scandal of softness. Enter the bizarre rituals surrounding this sacrosanct dessert. Before each bite, the father's knife was ceremonially inspected for sharpness, lest the éclair be purposely ruined. The éclair was to be sliced precisely into 4 parts, representing the 4 pillars of aristocracy. To eat an imperfect fraction was to invite ruin. A confessor was on call, ready to absolve anyone who dared indulge in the pastry with impure intentions. And the kitchen was under surveillance by a self-appointed flour brigade, a group of elite bakers who pledged fidelity to the crispy creed. The tension peaks when the prodigal pastry audaciously suggests a simple rest. Yes, rest, for a single éclair to sit undisturbed, softening in peace. Gasps erupt. The fellow noble guests clutch their pearls and fans with dramatic flair, scandalous as a guillotine joke at the king's dinner. Then, with the solemnity of a revolutionary manifesto, the éclair is set aside, untouched, for a full 5 minutes, an eternity in pastry time. The kitchen staff hold their breath. The flour brigade trembles. Lo and behold, the éclair defies expectations. Its sogginess transmutes into a tender, almost transcendent softness. Palates previously primed to condemn now sigh in delighted bewilderment. The pastry, long feared as the harbinger of laziness and rebellion, becomes a bizarre symbol of indulgence. No, not in excess, but in rest. It turns out sometimes the prodigal pastry was simply advocating for a break, not just from the relentless, puffed perfection of aristocracy, but from life itself. Historically, the French Revolution was not only a fight for liberty and equality, but also an unexpected redefinition of culinary values. While headless nobles became an unfortunate fashion trend, bakers across France became clandestine rebels, experimenting with textures and softness in defiance of royal rigidity. So what do we take from this crumb-strewn saga? If your éclair feels soggy, it may just be on the cusp of greatness. Sometimes, the sweetest revolution is to let things rest a little longer. Because in life, as in pastry, softness might just be proof of proof. The scene opens on a misty morning in 17th century France, circa 1635, in a small village where the bread is as crusty as the villagers' attitudes, and the yeast is considered the most dangerous ingredient in the kingdom. The camera zooms into a bustling bakery where the dough is rising, and so is the tension. A trumpet blast imagined, of course, signals the start of the Great Yeast Rebellion. The smell of freshly baked pain au chocolat wafts through the air, mingling with the inevitable whiffs of sweat, desperation, and stale ale from the neighboring tavern. Inside the bakery, we meet Pierre, the local baker, whose proudest achievement is producing bread so dense it doubles as a doorstop. The prized ingredient in question, yeast, a seemingly innocent microbe that at this time is about to cause societal upheaval. Yeast was historically treated like a witch at a village trial, feared for its mysterious rising powers, and blamed for anything from failed harvests to political unrest. The townsfolk engaged in elaborate rituals to appease the yeast powers, such as whispering incantations to freshly mixed dough and offering crumbs to the kitchen spirits, lest their bread betray them by refusing to rise. This wasn't just baking. It was high-stakes alchemy. As word spreads, paranoia flares. Local noblewomen begin hoarding their yeast, hiding it beneath velvet cushions. Village elders recount apocryphal tales where a loaf baked without yeast allegedly caused mass fainting at the church service. Pierre is caught in the middle, accused of secret yeast experiments that might summon demonic gluten. The camera follows the baker navigating a minefield of suspicion, all while trying not to let his dough collapse under pressure. Then, in a twist worthy of a soap opera, the village baker's apprentice, tired of all the yeast hysteria, decides to bake a simple flatbread. Yeast-free. This act, shockingly, leads to the greatest peace treaty in village history, because suddenly everyone can agree on something that doesn't rise or fall. Historical context reveals that yeast actually underwent scientific demystification centuries later, when Louis Pasteur had the good sense to study it under a microscope, exposing the truth behind the once feared leavening agent. The moral? When life gives you paranoid villagers and mysterious microbes, sometimes all you need is a flatbread and a little common sense. Never underestimate the power of food to ferment more drama than the palace intrigues themselves. The scene is set in a small, suspiciously fragrant village bakery, somewhere in Renaissance Europe, year circa 1523, at the ungodly hour of dawn when even the yeast is supposed to be asleep. But no, this morning the air is thick with tension and the unmistakable scent of overambitious sourdough. Meet Pietro, the prodigal son, whose family claims he's been gone so long nobody's sure if he's actually allergic to work or just very committed to his naps. Highlighting the scene are his father, Giuseppe, a man so attached to his bread oven he's rumored to have tried to marry it, and the entire village council, whose idea of justice involves a lot of pointing and grumbling about stale rye. The star of this civil war is a loaf of bread of such dubious texture and questionable aroma that it has become a metaphor for the village's collective patience. Lights flicker on, casting long, dramatic shadows over flour-covered aprons and faces etched with existential carb crises. There is an underlying soundtrack of creaking wooden beams and the occasional disgruntled crow reminding everyone that nature too judges this bakery's output harshly. As the villagers gather, we learn that bread is not just bread here. It is the currency of respect, the measure of honor, and, occasionally, the weapon of choice in family disputes. Pietro proposes an outrageous idea. What if someone else handled the baking? The suggestion sends shockwaves strong enough to disturb the local pigeons mid-flight. Local lore dictates that sourdough starters are practically sacrosanct, guarded like golden calves or royal jewels, handed down from generation to generation in a ceremonial transfer that involves cryptic incantations, secret flour blends, and a suspicious number of small fires. Pietro's proposal to relax those age-old customs is seen by many as a declaration of war against tradition itself. The villagers begin a series of ever more ridiculous rituals to appease the bread gods, offering up burnt crusts as sacrifices, wearing flour sacks as a sign of penitence, and interpreting the patterns of kneaded dough as ominous portents reminiscent of ancient runes. Suspicion escalates until the loaf is inspected under the village's only magnifying glass. a contraption half borrowed from a blacksmith and half cobbled together by the local apothecary, which confirms beyond doubt that literally nobody can agree if the bread is delicious or just hopelessly meh. The climax arrives when Pietro, in a dramatic flourish, breaks the loaf and reveals that the inside is perfectly mediocre. The crowd gasps simultaneously, partly in shock, and partly because mediocre bread is unexpectedly disappointing when you're used to existential dread instead. It turns out the loaf was never the problem. It was the unbearable weight of expectation kneaded into every crumb. With this revelation, the village reluctantly acknowledges that sometimes a loaf can be just a loaf, and that maybe Pietro's naps had more wisdom than their sourdough had flavor. History notes that, following this scandalous bread truce, the village introduced the concept of the afternoon siesta, mostly because everyone was too exhausted to argue anymore. Remember, the moral here is clear. Never underestimate the power of a mediocre loaf to bring an entire village to its doughy knees. And perhaps, just sometimes, the best rest comes not from changing the starter, but from putting down the rolling pin and taking a proper nap. Picture this. Mid-16th century Paris, a bustling bakery at the crack of dawn where the smell of freshly baked bread mingles dangerously with the urban symphony of horse hooves and unwashed laundry protests. The protagonist? A loaf of bread so gloriously overrisen it threatens the structural integrity of its own existence and the patience of the local boulanger, who dreams of a quiet day without yeast rebellion. This isn't just any loaf. It is the great ambitious bread, a dough ball with delusions of grandeur, puffed up with enough pride and yeast to topple the humble baguette throne. The lighting is dim, the bakery cluttered with flour-dusted relics of bread wars past, and the air is a heady mix of toasted crust and the faint undertone of existential dread that only a fermenting carb can inspire. Our key characters. Pierre, the weary baker with hands permanently coated in dough. Madame Claudette, a witchy regular claiming to have her own special starter that can breathe life into any bread. And the elusive loaf, the star of this existential market drama. Now, tensions rise quite literally as Pierre battles the over-enthusiastic gluten matrix that threatens to burst through every linen cloth in sight. There are superstitions at play here. If the bread rises too high, it's said the loaf traps mischievous spirits who then haunt the eater with relentless indigestion and existential pity. Locals perform half-hearted rituals, clapping 3 times clockwise around the oven, whispering ancient incantations about yeast gods, to keep these spirits pacified, though quietly most suspect it is just Pierre's aggressive kneading technique. As the loaf swells beyond reason, neighbors peek nervously, clutching their breakfast croissants like life preservers. Then comes the twist. When Pierre finally manages to slide the bread into the oven, expecting either a glorious crust or a bakery apocalypse, the loaf stubbornly deflates mid-bake, collapsing into something resembling a crusty pancake that still manages to offend the senses with its defiant sogginess. The crowd outside gasps, the mice in the corner blink in disbelief, and Madame Claudette mutters darkly about cursed grains and the wrath of carb gods ignored. Historically, the rise and fall of bread mirrored social status. Bread too white or too lofty could be suspiciously linked to vanity or witchcraft, depending on your neighborhood. But here's the kicker. Sometimes, no matter how high you rise, you'll end up flat. And the only thing you'll have to show for it is a slightly soggy crust and stories to bore your grandchildren with. Moral of the tale? Don't let your bread or your ambitions rise too fast without a solid mix of patience, humility, and maybe a pinch of salt. After all, even the softest parables are best served with a side of sarcastic crumb wisdom. Picture this. The year is 1593, somewhere in a dimly lit Parisian bakery that smells suspiciously like a mix of burnt crust and existential dread. The flour dust hangs in the air like a fragile fog, and the only sound breaking the silence is the frantic scratching of a baker's quill as he documents what can only be described as the Great Bread Crisis. The culprit? Something as simple as bread gone rogue. Our key players are the baker Monsieur Flourdeau, a man whose nose rivals a bloodhound's when it comes to detecting burnt edges, and his star creation, the legendary sourdough loaf, the pride of the neighborhood, and apparently the harbinger of unexpected chaos. This is not just any bread. It's a living, breathing thing fueled by mysterious yeast cultures rumored to have been stolen from a secretive monastery, where monks whispered ancient fermentation spells between chants. The bakery is bathed in the orange glow of early morning sunlight, streaming through stained glass windows, which cast kaleidoscopic shadows on piles of flour sacks suspiciously labeled in Latin, probably a secret code for do not eat before the crisis blows over. The air hums with anticipation. The scent a curious blend of yeast, sweat, and vague hints of rebellion. But then things start to get weird. Baker Flourdeau notices the sourdough refusing to rise rightly, puffing up with an attitude that suggests it's harboring a grudge against humanity. This isn't just passive-aggressive baking, it's outright defiance. Each loaf seems to develop its own personality, some aggressive, others melancholic. The entire neighborhood faces a bread mutiny, an uprising that goes beyond dietary inconvenience. Local lore quickly spins into frantic theories. Perhaps the yeast had absorbed too much Protestant sermonizing, or maybe a curse cast by a jealous rival baker who was secretly married to the queen's courtesan. Citizens begin performing elaborate rituals, kneading circles thrice sunward, blessing their ovens with holy water, and even whispering apologies to the gluten gods. There's a near riot when a batch of croissants refuses to be flaky and instead turns stubbornly soggy, interpreted by townsfolk as signs of the doughy apocalypse. Amidst the chaos, a reluctant hero emerges, a pastry apprentice known only as Petit Crust. With nothing but a wooden spoon and a suspiciously sweet tooth, Petit Crust bravely confronts the rebellious loaves. The solution? An unexpected twist of culinary alchemy. A secret ingredient, a pinch of honey stolen from a beekeeper's reluctant stash, said to calm even the most tempestuous of fermentations. Once the honey mixes into the dough, order is restored. The bread rises harmoniously, and the sourdough resumes its role as the humble staple rather than a covert insurgent. The neighborhood exhales collectively, the crisis averted by the simplest act of kindness and sticky sweetness. Historically, yeast was often treated with near mystical suspicion as a living organism capable of mood swings and malice, explaining the elaborate folklore and superstitions baked into daily life. In truth, the randomness of fermentation often baffled early bakers and scientists alike, kind of like trying to teach a cat to fetch. So what's the takeaway here? When your bread starts acting like it wants to overthrow the monarchy, just add a little honey and maybe schedule a nap. If nothing else, it's sweet, it's soft. Imagine a dimly lit 17th century French bakery. Somewhere around 1642, where the sleepy sun hesitates to rise past the fog, and the aroma is thick with the warm scent of crusty rye. If someone could actually trust the baker not to have sabotaged his own loaf for extra drama. The room buzzes with the low murmurs of flower-covered philosophers, and a single, perpetually beleaguered apprentice who is definitely questioning life choices. At the center of this culinary stage sits the prized rye loaf, allegedly capable of inducing not merely digestion but existential quandaries for the local guild of bread enthusiasts. The key players are Monsieur Le Pain, the austere master baker famed for treating loaf shaping like an arcane ritual, and his younger brother, Etienne, whose reckless disregard for proofing times was whispered about in bakery basements like blasphemy. Tonight's controversy? Whether the proper rest, the period when dough is meant to relax and rise, is an absolute necessity, or an overhyped bourgeois myth concocted to merchandise more leisure time and gossip. Lighting flickers from a lone flickering tallow candle, casting elongated shadows on walls dusted with centuries of flour residue. The scent is a pungent cocktail of yeast battling against sourdough starter gone rogue, while faint echoes of a lute being awkwardly strummed in the corner remind everyone that art and bread-making are indistinctly intertwined. Monsieur Le Pain insists that the dough must rest exactly 3 hours. No more, no less. A sacred number allegedly revealed in a forgotten manuscript discovered under a pile of stale croissants. On the other hand, Etienne, fueled by youthful hubris and the stubbornness of neglected apprentices everywhere, declares that dough can be punched down and baked immediately, claiming the ritual rest is a tragic waste of bakery minutes. Here, tension rises like unproofed dough on a humid day. The local guild watches, some clutching prayer beads made from stale baguettes, as if invoking the gods of gluten. Rumors circulate that skipping rest might awaken the wrath of the yeast spirits, mythical creatures said to turn hastily baked bread into inedible bricks capable of shattering an ambitious eater's jaw. The kitchen is rife with superstition. Salt must be blessed thrice by the apprentice's great-grandmother's ghost. The oven's temperature is read by consulting the sandwich board, or, on mystic days, fortunes drawn from toasted crusts. As the fateful moment arrives, Etienne slams the dough into the oven, ignoring the whispered warnings and the collective gasps from the flour-coated audience. Minutes crawl by, a silence so thick it could be sliced into artisanal bread. The breadcrumb trail of tension leads to the reveal. A loaf emerges, decidedly dense and suspiciously flat, its crust having the audacity to crack, not with a pleasing crunch, but with the somber snap of a sad guitar string. Monsieur Le Pain raises an eyebrow so high it nearly detaches from his forehead. Etienne grins, proud yet haunted. The bread neither honors tradition nor entirely offends the palate, a culinary identity crisis baked into every crumb. In the unexpected epilogue, it turns out the famously stringent proofing times were actually a misinterpretation of an ancient recipe that originally said rest the dough as long as your patience can bear, a concept tragically lost in translation by overzealous bakers generations past. Thus, it was not about strict hours, but about finding a balance between haste and heedlessness, a parable for life wrapped in a rye crust. A historical footnote for the bread line, early French bakers likely invented the ritual of resting dough mainly so they could enjoy long lunches and dawdle over politics without guilt. So, what lessons can we chew on from this slice of history? Clearly, letting dough, and by extension your life, rest is an underrated art. After all, if your bread feels rushed, so might you. And remember, in the grand bake picture this. The year 1723, a dimly lit banquet hall in the heart of an overambitious European palace, where the chandeliers drip with so much wax they might legally qualify as interior landscaping. The air smells faintly of roasted boar, desperation, and the unmistakable scent of aristocratic ennui. Tonight, the high society has gathered not for love, politics, or war, but to engage in their most sacred ritual, the great debate over the proper usage of a dinner fork. Enter Lord Blunderbuss, a gentleman whose distinguished mustache is as wildly untamed as his opinions on table etiquette. Alongside him is Lady Persnickety, the reigning queen of dinner-party minutiae, wielding a napkin folded with such precision it could cut glass. Together, they preside over what has come to be known far and wide as the Feast of the Forgotten Fork. On the long mahogany table rests the infamous centerpiece, the elusive, misunderstood fork. Its prongs glisten under candlelight, trembling beneath the weight of centuries of misuse and misunderstanding. This seemingly innocuous utensil has become the tinderbox for social upheaval faster than you can say pass the salt. As guests take their seats, the tension is edible, thicker than the gravy poured over the suspiciously dry pheasant. The whispers begin. Is it gauche to spear a piece of bread? Should one twirl spaghetti with fingers or fork? The fork, so innocent yet so divisive, sparkles in the flickering light, threatening to ignite a culinary civil war. The scene becomes a theater of absurdity. A cardinal busies himself muttering prayers for the souls of lost dinners past. A chamberlain, nervously glancing at a silver fork, swears it carries a curse that causes mild indigestion and severe social faux pas. Meanwhile, a nervous violinist plays a somber tune titled How to Survive a Supper Without a Scandal. The most sacred ritual commences. The first usage of the fork is observed by all like a nuclear launch. Lord Blunderbuss attempts a graceful stab at a roast potato, but ends up launching it across the room, where it lands squarely in the Earl of Snortington's wig. Gasses ensue. Lady Persnickety clutches her pearls. A distant cousin faints into his wineglass. Suddenly, a jester proposes a shocking idea. What if the fork was not a tool of division, but a symbol of unity? What if the food fights, the etiquette wars, and the simmering class tensions could be solved with one simple gesture of shared awkwardness? The crowd is silent. Then laughter erupts, breaking the ice thicker than leftover pie. And just like that, the great fork fiasco ends not with a duel but a dance, an accidental food-spattered ballet célèbre. Historically speaking, the fork was once considered a heretical contraption, a foreign invader in a world of knives and spoons. Nobles often resisted it, fearing that too much civility at the table might lead to political softness elsewhere. Yet, over time, the fork won the day, not by force, but through a series of awkward dinners and sheer persistence. So what did our ancestors teach us with their cranky bickering over dining implements? Simple. Never underestimate the power of a tiny pronged stick to unravel centuries of decorum and stitch together moments of chaotic camaraderie. Moral of the tale: rest is found not in perfect manners, but in the shared laughs over spilled gravy and wayward potatoes. Sometimes the prodigal son isn't the one who leads. Picture this. Paris, 1789. The dawn of revolution is crisp in the air, but what's that unmistakable scent wafting through the foggy streets? Not the guillotine's cold metal serenade, but the seductive, buttery whisper of freshly baked croissants. A seemingly innocent pastry, destined to become the unwitting hero in a saga of sugar, flour, and existential dread. We find ourselves in the nooks and crannies of a dimly lit bakery, flames licking the brick oven like a devilish dance partner. The air is thick with the aroma of caramelizing sugar and burnt hopes. Here, amidst the flurry of flour-dusted bakers with jittery hands, some twitching more from revolutionary fervor than baking stress, we meet John, the plucky sous chef whose hands have molded more dough than 1,000 barristers' legal arguments. At the heart of this chaos, the deemed people's pastry, a golden, crescent-shaped croissant, jam-packed with layers of butter so indulgent it could corrupt even the most stoic revolutionist. But the croissant wasn't just breakfast. It was a battleground where ideological crumbs scattered like shrapnel. Legend dictated that the croissant's dough had to be folded exactly 13 times, no more, no less, because 13 was both unlucky and the symbolic number of oppressed provinces yearning for liberty. Rituals were performed with religious zeal. Bakers would chant ancient yeasted hymns, sprinkle secret blends of flour blessed by monks, and cross themselves thrice to keep the royal witchcraft from flattening their flaky masterpieces. Yet scandal brewed like an overproofed dough. Whispers gnawed on the cobblestones. Had the royal sympathizers poisoned the butter? Was the yeast a saboteur? Paranoia soared. One baker was found weeping over a batch of dough that refused to rise, claiming it was a metaphor for the failing revolution. A rival bakery was accused of smuggling in inferior margarine, the culinary equivalent of treason. The climax? On Bastille Day, the entire city gathered to witness the unveiling of the Grand Croissant, an audacious attempt to unify the populace through pastry. As the ribbon was cut, a collective gasp echoed, not due to its beauty, but because the flaky crust collapsed mid-carve, oozing suspiciously undercooked butter like a traitorous river. And then, the twist. It wasn't sabotage. It was simply a matter of badly timed ovens in a city that had more urgent concerns than perfect baking. The revolution wouldn't wait for pastry perfection, and apparently, neither would the butter. Historically speaking, while croissants didn't start their fame in France until later, the myth of their revolutionary role is deliciously misleading. Much like the revolution itself, the story is flaky, layered, and best enjoyed with a pinch of skepticism. So, what's the takeaway? Never underestimate the rising power of dough, especially when folded with the weight of a revolution. But perhaps the true lesson here is that sometimes even the mightiest upheavals can be flattened by an undercooked croissant. Picture it. A chilly autumn evening in 14th century Florence. The grand hall of a nobleman's estate is dimly lit by flickering tallow candles that sputter like reluctant storytellers. The air is heavy with the aroma of smoked meats and the unmistakable scent of impending civil unrest. Well, at least among the diners. At center stage sits the heroic food of the hour, the humble yet dangerously political meatball. Yes, meatballs, those innocent-looking spheres of dubious ingredients about to stir more drama than the latest papal decree. Our protagonist, the prodigal son of the house, recently returned from a questionable sojourn of excess and mystery, known primarily for his talent to disappear at will and his suspiciously large appetite for risk. Alongside him is his stern father, a man who believes that meatballs are not merely a meal, but a divine test of loyalty and culinary virtue. The scene is set with servants scurrying nervously, chopping parsley with the urgency of prophets delivering bad news. Each meatball is rumored to be seasoned with a secret blend passed down through generations. Part culinary tradition, part weaponized herbal cocktail designed to distinguish friend from traitor upon digestion. As the first meatballs are served, an ancient ritual unfolds. Each guest must declare their allegiance by how many meatball bites they dare consume. Legends suggest that swallowing 3 means you're trustworthy, 4 if you're ambitious, and 5 or more if you're plotting a coup, though no one can confirm who started this myth, possibly the local tavern storyteller with a flair for drama. The tension thickens with every bite. The prodigal son eyes the 4th meatball with the calculating gaze of a seasoned gambler, while his father sweats enough to fill a small reservoir beneath his chainmail vest. Nearby, an overzealous cousin confides in whispers about the green-speckled meatballs potentially being enchanted by a rival family's witch to induce uncontrollable hiccups. A fate worse than death in medieval etiquette. Amidst this culinary battlefield, the servants execute a carefully choreographed dance to whisper coded messages through the clinking of goblets and the crash of napkin rings. The family's astrologer, having spent the afternoon consulting entrails of which meatballs might be a curious source, announces that planetary alignments favor the bold but advise caution against saucy betrayals. Just as the prodigal son bravely reaches for the 5th meatball, the feast is interrupted by the sudden arrival of the family dog, innocently but decisively snatching a stray meatball from the floor and vanishing into the shadows. This unexpected canine culinary critique causes an explosive diversion. Guests erupt into laughter. The tension dissolves like a fragile truffle in hot broth. Turns out, the dog's preference endorses the meatballs as harmless and possibly delicious, diffusing hostilities and proving once and for all that sometimes wisdom comes with a wagging tail rather than a clenched fist or fork. Historically, medieval meatballs were indeed often a byproduct of resourcefulness rather than refinement, filled with what could generously be called mystery meats. Yet, their unlikely ability to unite or divide a dining hall reflects the subtle art of politics wrapped in breadcrumbs and spices. So what's the takeaway from this savory saga? In times of familial or political strife, sometimes the softest food, a humble meatball, holds the hardest truths. Or at least it distracts everyone long enough to avoid an actual fight. Remember, never underestimate the diplomatic power of dinner, especially when it includes a dog-approved meatball. Picture this: a dusty Judean afternoon, circa some ancient year that sounds biblical enough to matter. The sun blazes nearly as fiercely as the impatience of a certain young man who just demanded his inheritance like it was an Amazon Prime delivery and promptly vanished, probably in search of Wi-Fi or maybe just a spot with better falafel. The air smells of desert dust, unwashed sheepskins, and the faint yet unmistakable aroma of stale bread, the sort actually prized for its ability to double as a medieval frisbee. Our cast of characters includes the prodigal son, a sprightly young fellow with a wallet full of hopes and a head full of questionable decisions. His father, an embodiment of patience bordering on miraculous, and the elder brother, whose moodiness could sour milk faster than the heat of midday. At the heart of this family drama, not gold or land, but a festive banquet featuring the gastronomic delight of porridge. Grain boiled until it reaches a consistency both terrifyingly bland and suspiciously glue-like. This humble dish, however, is about to become the pivot point of jealousy, forgiveness, and some of the earliest recorded instances of family therapy. Tension simmered like the porridge itself in the household. The younger son's disappearance was as unwelcome as a surprise guest who eats all your bread without offering coffee. Meanwhile, the elder brother grumbled louder than a goat caught in a thunderstorm, convinced that justice was served better cold than hot, much like the leftover porridge he was grudgingly forced to swallow. Adding to the absurdity were the rituals surrounding the food. The porridge was ladled out with the solemnity of a sacred rite, accompanied by superstitious incantations meant to ward off evil spirits and indigestion alike. It was said that the exact number of spoonfuls slid into one's bowl determined one's fate for the coming week, a belief eagerly disproven in countless slip and spill incidents. The climax arrived with the younger son's dramatic and somewhat awkward return, draped in the symbolic robes of humility and whatever was clean at the market. The father ordered the fatted calf, or, in this iteration, a particularly plump jar of winter-aged cheese to be brought forth, and the porridge was served with a side of forgiveness thicker than the stew itself. But here's the twist. The porridge, that sticky symbol of domestic reconciliation, was secretly undercooked, resulting in a communal stomachache that united the family in a less than spiritual way. It was less a holy feast, and more a cautionary tale about the dangers of rushing forgiveness and cooking. Historically speaking, the parable underscores the importance of rest, community, and the occasional indulgence in ill-prepared carbohydrates. Ancient societies often used food as a metaphor for societal healing, or at least as a reason to stop squabbling long enough to eat. So what have we learned from this ancient saga? Never underestimate the power of family grudges served alongside porridge, and remember, sometimes the stomach protests louder than the soul, especially when the chef clearly needed more time off. Imagine a cold, foggy morning in 17th century Holland, 1632 to be exact, in a bustling cheese market that smells like a barnyard and a bakery had an ill-fated tango. Peddlers shout prices with the enthusiasm of auctioneers battling for the last wheel of cheese on here earth. Amidst the raucous crowd, our key players emerge. Jan van der Mold, a humble cheese merchant with dreams far bigger than his wooden stall, and a particularly disgruntled goat whose protests punctuate the salty air. The center of today's dairy drama? A wheel of Gouda cheese so large and pungent it could double as a medieval weapon of mass nasal destruction. The lighting is a dim mix of early dawn mist filtering through wooden slats, and the flickering flames of nearby street lamps struggling to stay lit. The scent of aged milk mingles with the sharp tang of vinegar used for cleaning stalls, a sensory cocktail guaranteed to make one question their life choices. Jan, dressed in a slightly threadbare waistcoat and a hat that has seen better centuries, lovingly pats the monumental cheese, unaware his ambitions will soon curdle. Enter the tension. News spreads fast in stall-packed markets. This Gouda is rumored to hold the secret powers. Whispers claim it can grant a man good fortune, or curse him with the eternal stink of regret. Superstitions abound, including the ancient ritual of spinning the cheese 3 times clockwise while reciting the cheesemonger's prayer, a litany mostly remembered for its closing line. Bless this stink, for it speaks what words cannot. Paranoia runs high. A rival merchant tries to replace the wheel with a doctored double smeared in horseradish. The crowd watches as Jan prepares to cut the first slice, the blade humming ominously. Suddenly, the disgruntled goat, sensing mischief and perhaps a chance for dairy revenge, leaps onto the table, scattering cheese and sliced bread alike. Chaos erupts. Shouts mix with the braying of the goat. The cheesemonger's prayer is forgotten. The wheeled treasure rolls down the marketplace, knocking over crates like a roving dairy boulder. Here comes the twist. As the chaos subsides, it is revealed the entire incident was staged by Jan himself, a clever marketing ploy to make his Gouda infamous enough to sell itself. The goat belongs to his cousin. The rival merchant was a hired actor, and the prayer was a concocted farce invented on the spot. Success floods in, as everyone wants a piece of the legendary Great Gouda of Fate. Historically, cheese has long been a symbol of wealth and status in Dutch society, but rarely has it been so intentionally weaponized for profit. Proof that even the stinkiest commodities can transcend their smell to become legends. So what does our dairy saga teach us? Never underestimate the power of a good stink, a little chaos, and the marketing genius of a man with a goat. Even the smallest wedge of cheese can carve out a legacy. Imagine the year as a particularly uneventful chapter in medieval Europe, sometime around the 1300s, an era when a loaf of bread could inspire more drama than a season of royal intrigue. Picture a castle kitchen where sunlight struggles through grimy windows, casting a suspiciously ominous glow on a pile of unusually yeasty dough. The scent? Equal parts fermented dreams and existential dread. Enter our protagonist, a dough that just won't rise, and the king's bewildered baker who's convinced this humble loaf holds the fate of the kingdom. Because in these times, bread wasn't just bread, it was a statement about who you were and how much patience you had left. The courtiers gather, their tunics rustling with anticipation, eyeing this dough as if it might spontaneously grow legs and run off to start its own revolt. The king demands perfection, an unblemished, fluffy spectacle, to prove his power extends from throne to table. Our baker, a man who's somehow survived past kitchen disasters resembling small fires and emotional breakdowns, is now under siege. The kitchen is lit by the frantic flicker of candles, the air heavy with the acrid smell of burnt hopes and flour dust that could choke a dragon. The tension is palpable enough to slice with a butter knife if it weren't reserved solely for ceremonial bread slicing. Enter the absurdity. In an attempt to coax the dough to rise, the baker calls upon every superstition known to the medieval world. A pinch of salt from the holy hand of a suspected witch, whispered prayers to the patron saint of bakers, a figment of collective imagination, and even a bizarre ritual where the dough is serenaded with the softest lute music, performed by a troubadour who may or may not be tone deaf. The castle's jester is tasked with keeping spirits high, juggling not just figurines but his own anxiety as the bread's fate dangles like a poorly hung tapestry. As minutes stretch into what feels like an eternity, the baker, tired and with flour smudged on his face like war paint, reveals the twist. The loaf had been sitting in the wrong cellar all along, swapping places with a hunk of moldy cheese. The kingdom's great bread crisis deflates as quickly as the failed dough. The king is more baffled than angry, while courtiers quietly mourn the missed opportunity to make a heroic story out of a loaf. Historically speaking, bread baking really was a serious business, one that could make or break a manor's reputation. Not to mention the sneaky political implications when a servant's bread turned out better than the lord's. But fear not, the lesson is clear. Even in the Middle Ages, sometimes the greatest drama comes not from battlefields, but from the bakery. So, what have we learned? If your kingdom is on the brink, double-check the cellar inventory before blaming your baker. Sometimes, the answer to problems isn't heroic effort. It's just properly placed bread. Picture this. England, 1742. A foggy afternoon thick enough to hide even the more inept highwaymen. The place, a grand manor house so lavish it would make Versailles look like a toddler's finger painting. The scent wafts through the air. Warm butter, cinnamon, and a subtle undertone of whispered betrayals. Because today is the day the infamous Great Pie Rebellion is about to unfold. In the grand dining hall, under the flicker of dozens of ornate candles, sits a humble yet deceptively dangerous dessert, a seemingly innocent apple pie, glazed to golden perfection and stuffed with enough cinnamon to cause mild hysteria. The scene is set with plush crimson drapes, polished oak tables that have seen more secrets than a confessional booth, and servants bustling in powdered wigs that threaten to shed dandruff at the slightest misstep. Around the table are the key players. Lord Beauchamp, a man whose waistcoat was tighter than his patience. Lady Gertrude, whose sharp tongue was the stuff of tavern legends. And the prodigal son himself, young Master Horace, recently returned from his prodigal lifestyle of reckless spending and questionable company. The apple pie is more than just dessert tonight. It's the battleground for inheritance, honor, and perhaps a little bit of revenge. But this pie, dear viewer, is rumored to be cursed, or at least that's what the Manor's cook insists as she clutches a garlic clove for protection. Local superstition holds that any pastry baked during the waning moon of a leap year will bring ruin upon the family, a belief only inflamed by the unsettling fact that the pie is studded with cloves shaped suspiciously like tiny, menacing fists. The ritual surrounding the serving is nothing short of theatrical. Before the first slice is cut, Lady Gertrude performs an archaic, whispered incantation to ward off the spirits of indigestion. Meanwhile, Lord Beauchamp insists on inspecting the pie crust for signs of tampering, using a jeweler's loupe borrowed from his wife's neglected trinket box. Every slice echoes off the high ceilings like a judge's gavel, each bite a calculated move in this culinary chess match. Tensions bubble like the steam rising from the pie. The prodigal son feigns ignorance, cutting his slice with exaggerated care, while eyes narrowed behind lace fans watch for signs of weakness, or worse, poison. And then, Just as Master Horace raises his fork, a shriek pierces the room. The family cat, a notoriously surly beast named Mr. Whiskers, leaps onto the table, upending the pie and scattering crust and filling across the floor. Chaos ensues. Lady Gertrude's pearl necklace snaps. Lord Beauchamp's wig tilts sideways. The prodigal son seizes the moment to make a somewhat graceless exit. The twist? The curse was less lunar magic and more feline mischief. Mr. Whiskers, it turns out, merely had a profound disdain for cinnamon and pies, prompting an impromptu family reunion on the kitchen floor to clean up both the mess and decades-old grudges. Historically speaking, pastry has often played an underestimated role in noble squabbles, from Shakespearean pies gifting us metaphorical poison to the real-life tumultuous feuds sparked by insufficient sugar rations during the Regency era. Apples, cinnamon, and intrigue. An exquisite recipe for disaster. So what's the moral here? Perhaps it is this: never underestimate the power of a well-timed feline bombing and resolving family drama. And never, ever trust a pie that looks too perfect. It might just be plotting your downfall. The year is 1723. The place, a sleepy village somewhere between nowhere and nowhere special. Dawn breaks with the subtle charm of a rooster who's clearly had one too many ales the night before. The scent of damp earth mingles with a faint and decidedly suspicious aroma wafting from the village bakery, a smell best described as yeast gone rogue. Inside the bakery, light filters through stained glass windows, casting a kaleidoscope of colors on dust motes dancing in the lazy air. The counters are cluttered with flour sacks, wooden dough bowls, and what appears to be the village's collective hope. A massive batch of bread dough rumbling quietly as if plotting a yeasty uprising. The key players: Gertrude, the formidable baker with a scowl that could sour milk; Tobias, the timid apprentice who has yet to understand the concept of personal space; and the village council, a group of men so concerned with the bread's fate they've appointed a self-proclaimed yeast whisperer. Bread here isn't just food. It's survival, currency, and apparently a potent symbol of communal pride and paranoia. Locals carry talismans. A crumpled recipe scroll passed down from some legendary baker whose name no one remembers but whose bread eternally rises, believed to ensure that dough would cooperate during kneading. As the dough ferments, rumors ferment faster. Is this batch cursed? Has Tobias accidentally invited a fungal uprising? Whispers circulate that last week's loaf, oddly shaped and disturbingly crunchy in the crust, was a harbinger of a doom. The yeast whisperer insists on daily rituals, chanting strange incantations over the dough, attempting to soothe its unruly spirit with a lullaby that suspiciously sounds like a nursery rhyme mashed up with a tavern drinking song. Tension rises like the overactive dough. Villagers gather around the bakery, eyes darting nervously, ready to riot if the bread fails to live up to its crumbly reputation. The council debates deploying a formal bread council, drafting edicts on how many times dough must be punched and how often loaves should be blessed. Meanwhile, Tobias, overwhelmed and sticky-handed, contemplates a career in shepherding. Then, the twist. The yeast whisperer, in a dramatic flourish, reveals the secret to the village's baking woes. The yeast was simply expired. Not cursed, not rebellious, just ancient and dead, The bread was refusing to rise because it physically could not. The village pauses, processes, and collectively exhales, disappointment tinged with a touch of relief. Historically speaking, expired yeast has caused more panic than plague in small communities that mistake science for sorcery. The baker's paranoia was only amplified by poor storage and too many superstitions stacked like overproofed bread. So, the moral of our doughy parable? Sometimes the biggest rebellions need no revolution, just fresher ingredients. And always remember, a suspicious loaf is often just a loaf with commitment issues. As we gather to wrap up the whimsical tale of our wayward son, who stumbled through the follies of life only to find solace in the soft embrace of his father's old armchair, let us take a moment to reflect on the deeper lesson hidden within his misguided adventures. Ah, humanity, bless its deluded heart, has long foolishly believed it holds dominion over the animal kingdom, treating creatures as mute puppets in a cosmic play directed by our whims. Much like our prodigal progeny, we trot about, convinced that we're orchestrating the show, blissfully unaware that the true actors might just be plotting their own comedy or tragedy whenever we turn our backs. History has shown us that animals are not unconcerned observers, but vengeful spirits with quite the archive of grievances against their would-be masters. From the infamous rebellion of the cats silently plotting in Josephine's salon, to the legendary avian coup led by the pigeons of Paris following a particularly disdainful birdseed tax, animal vengeance is as real as the dog hair on your couch. And then there's the notorious tale from the annals of ancient Rome, when the noble cat of Caligula promptly clawed his way into heart-shaped pet treats, resulting in an unexpected uprising of felines against the depravity of decadent food choices, definitively proving that a well-fed cat is a happy cat, unless it's a cat disgruntled with lifestyle choices made by its human overlords. It's clear that the wheel of karma spins with great enthusiasm, albeit on 4 paws or sometimes with fins and feathers, leaving us mere mortals scrambling to pick up the pieces of our supposed control. So, dear audience, perhaps take heed of the subtle warning that our furry companions have been trying to convey all along. When that dog appears to be wagging his tail, just know he might be winding up for something far more sinister. And, as you leave here today, consider this final nugget of wisdom wrapped in jest. Sometimes the fluffiest tails come with the sharpest of claws. And really, who controls whom when the rubber chicken finally hits the fan? In the grand scheme of things, the real prodigal sons are probably just the animals who've left our houses, vowing never to return until absolutely necessary. Because, in the end, isn't it just the humans trying to fetch their own lives that often end up chasing their own tails? With that, I bid you all farewell. May your journeys be filled with forgiveness, peace, and an unwavering awareness